So let's talk about Death Stranding. There is a game here. Strangely enough, there is an actual game in Death Stranding, but you've got to stick with it. There's a long grind. It takes a while for you to for it to become apparent, but there is an actual game to be played. Notwithstanding, I think this game is going to get poor reviews. The reason it's going to get poor reviews, in my opinion, is due to the nature of the reviewers. There's going to be a race to get your review out because, when a game comes out, it's generally people try and get their reviews out first while interest is peaked. And so I think a lot of reviewers won't have the time to put into this game. It took me 71 hours to finish this game. It was a slog at times. At times, I even took a break for a night or two. I was like, no, I'm just going to take a break, because it was just so much of a slog. But there is a game here. The combat system does become apparent later on. Some of the mechanics in the game start to make sense later on in the game. It has its flaws, and I will talk about those. But I think, from the point of view of the reviewers, I don't think it's a review-friendly game in the sense that most reviewers want to play through the game quick and get their reviews out. I think quite possibly a lot of them would have gone on the easy mode rather than the normal mode. I think most of the reviewers probably haven't even finished the game, to be quite honest with you, and that's fair enough, but I think that's problematic when, communicating a review, essentially. In true Kojima style, there's a lot of cutscenes and kind of narrative at the start. Maybe it's front-loaded. He kind of spins you around, gives you a slap in the ass, and kicks you out the door, where you're kind of overburdened at the start with storyline. It takes, I think it was 6 or 7 hours before I was actually playing the game, and not in some kind of Skinner box tutorial or being, just piled with the kind of story being front loaded and piled onto me and kind of leaving you kind of your head spinning at the start. After the first 11 hours or so of play, combat started to take off, and it was good. Once you start getting those grenades that that kind of lead up to that first boss battle, is really good. When you're kind of having to get through the BTs, through the mountains to Port Knot City, that was epic. That was really cool. I enjoyed that. I didn't have as much trouble as some people did with the walking mechanics. I think it worked out fine for me because I never overlaid my character with gear. I only, I tried to not stack gear really high on Sam and just kind of keep it, bare bones to only travel with what I needed. So I didn't find the kind of balancing and walking too much hassle. Could be annoying, I'd imagine, if you tried to overburden yourself, and I imagine again, due to the nature of reviewers trying to get through it quick, probably did do that. So yeah, when the combat system actually rolls out, it's not bad. The weapons are good. The sense of tension, the kind of holding your breath and all that stuff early on before you're given proper tools to combat the BTs is quite good. Some of the BTs are even, you come across gold ones that are quite strong, and you kind of have to learn when to fight, when not to fight. A lot of the time I was avoiding BT contact early on in the game until I had sufficient tools. Again, you get different bionic limbs that help you kind of all-terrain skeletons and stuff that make, kind of traversing the terrain a lot easier later on in the game. So, I enjoyed the game and had really strong characters. It was slow to get going, definitely slow to get going. I can see it throwing a lot of people off who aren't going to invest the time in to kind of enjoy the game. But there is a game here if you can find it. If you can stick with it, you're going to find a game that you could potentially enjoy. It's probably not going to be for everyone, but there is a game here. To say it's a walking simulator, I think, does it a disservice and kind of highlights the fact that maybe you're one of those players that just couldn't stick with it and drop the game. which is fair enough. I mean, that's happened to me with games in the past. But from the reviewer's perspective, I think a lot of the reviewers, it's not a reviewer-friendly game. I think the amount of time you have to put in and effort, it doesn't lend itself well to reviewer scores. Now to talk about the flaws in the game, because it definitely is flawed. I contributed to kind of building roads and other infrastructure early on in the game, and I just got bored with it. I went on raids into mule camps to try and get more resources so I could complete building these roads and building the different infrastructure, and it was too much of a slog. I gave up because the reward in relation to the risks you take just wasn't there. So I stopped doing that, and once I unlocked the zip line, I just started putting up zip lines because they were cheaper. You covered a lot of ground far quicker than roads, and it just became the way I traversed the map. I was putting up zip lines everywhere, and it nearly broke the game. It was the dominant strategy. Why build roads? Why spend hours collecting resources in amounts that weren't well balanced when I could just put up a zipline and zipline there? So that's what I did for most of the second half of the game. I just gave up on collecting resources. It was a pain. There was no payoff. That was my major problem with it. The combat as regards engaging with the mules was weak. BT's brilliant. I mean, whether you decided to take them on and go the direct approach, or sneak through the BT areas, both were, I found, rewarding in a sense. One thing I will say is that when you go into a BT area, often you go in, you might take 4 crates of grenades, the blood grenades, and an assault rifle, and go about kind of trying to clear out an area of BTs. That doesn't work. They keep respawning. So you're just wasting resources often if you're engaging with BTs like that. With that said, the combat does feel rewarding, and at times you will find resources that kind of tickle that risk-reward factor. But again, because you're wasting resources fighting BTs, the best option a lot of the time is just to avoid contact, and even at some stages within a BT area, if I could put up a zipline and get out of there, I usually did. So that brings me on to another thing that I worry about the game. So the longevity of the game is affected directly by the kind of player interactions. So by that I mean that, when resources you deploy are used by other players, that's fine when there's a player base, but what happens when there's no player base? It was at times really comforting at times when you'd find like a zip line or a rope or a ladder when you had just run out of those resources. So at times, it was really great having other players there. And the whole likes thing, that got a bit old. I didn't realize until towards the end of the game that giving likes to other players' stuff, like ladders, etc., actually meant that you got to use more ladders and more of other players' kind of structures that they had put down. In saying that, I never felt that there wasn't enough of that kind of stuff there. As an open world game, it's kind of strange as well, in the sense that you're never leaving like a drop off point without taking on another mission. So there's very few occasions where you're actually just out in the wild, just by yourself, kind of without a goal or an aim, just exploring the map. Anytime I did that, it felt rather punitive. There wasn't, I discovered parts of the map that maybe a bit too early on, or I forgot to take the order before I left for that area, and that kind of ground me down a little at times. But, once you get into the rhythm of it, you're fine. But again, that's that whole Skinner box mechanic where you take the order, you go out, you explore new parts of the map. Again, I found myself towards the end rushing. I was like, okay, well, this is what the game is now, so let me, rather than discover every area, I just wanted to push the story along and finish the game. I became kind of intrigued by the story in one sense. I mean, you need to suspend that suspension of belief. If you're going to be picky, there's huge plot holes, but there's plot holes in everything. I don't think you can kind of get bogged down in that. If you just, engage that suspension of belief, and you will enjoy the storyline that is there. It's a bit creepy at times. It's not my style at times, but it works. And I did somewhat enjoy the storyline. None of the kind of without any spoilers, none of the kind of big story elements caught me by surprise. They were all fairly well advertised and kind of flagged earlier on. I could see where the story was going. There were no twists and turns that kind of were jarring or like a big kind of reveal moment. The characters are strong. I did like all the characters. I thought Higgs was a great villain. I think without him, towards the latter part of the game, the game didn't really, because the character of Higgs is like the yin to your yang. So without him, the game kind of did suffer a little, which was unfortunate because the remaining characters, even though they were still strong, they weren't as menacing or as compelling as Higgs. And in a lot of ways, due to the kind of storyline and the narrative structure, they're not meant to be. But I think, getting rid of Higgs earlier in the game, kind of it did feel a little out of place. The final battle with Higgs is quite good, but I think they could have kept Higgs around because his just as a villain, he's a very good villain, and once he's gone, there's kind of a void there that none of the other characters are quite as big enough or as robust enough as to fill. So my final thoughts on Death Stranding, it's a tough one. I'm still kind of pondering and kind of making sense of some of it. I did enjoy the game. It was frustrating at times. It started off really slow. There wasn't much in the way of combat. It was only kind of doing these deliveries and kind of opening up more knots and things like that kind of became tedious. But once you make that trip to Port Knot City and go through the mountains and have that big kind of first engagement with BTs and then the subsequent boss battle, from then forth the combat does pick up. So there is a game there at that stage, but it takes a long time to get there. Then at times, the resources did drag on, building roads and all that. The dominant strategy for me became just putting up zip lines and traveling everywhere by zip line, and not bothering with the whole resource collection, because I thought even by going on raids and trying to acquire more resources, it became a slog, and the reward wasn't there. So I just gave up on that and ziplined everywhere. The storyline, the characters were awesome. Some really strange characters there that I perhaps found a little jarring, but you know what? It worked out in the end. The game did suffer from killing off Higgs, I think, too early. I think he could have probably served a purpose right up until the end, because none of the other characters were as menacing or as kind of imposing as Higgs. And once he was gone, yeah, you could see that there was a lack of that kind. No other character was going to be able to fill in for Higgs's villainy. Can I recommend this game? That's a strange one. If you're someone who plays a lot of games, then yeah, sure, I can, no problem. If you're kind of the type of person who enjoys the kind of From Software games or kind of those deep kind of single player games, yeah, sure, there's a game here for you. But if you're a casual enough kind of gamer, it's going to be tough to recommend this because it is a slog. That first part of the game where it's all story, a lot of hand holding, very little in the way of combat, very little in the way of mechanics, that can be jarring and will put people off and people will stop playing. If you're kind of used to slogging it in games, I think you'll be fine. I think there is a game here. It just takes a while to find it.